is the moderator here? Hi. So what languages do we have?
We all have English, but my sister in the green is Portuguese speaking.
Português.
Yeah.
Você.
And she is an interpreter, but we have new element representatives, right?
Ah, a gente agora pode fazer a tradução. Okay. See. Yeah. And do we have any English speakers here, or everybody's? Okay, English. Okay, English. Do we have any Spanish speakers here? No. Okay.
If we do suggest English, Portuguese, faz sense para Pavilion?
Yeah.
¿Cuáles son los canales? One for English. I just told her if she needs anything, she yes, but it should work. So you have yours as well for you have yours for her translation?
Yeah. Is there just one mic? And just one mic and I hand it over to the next, right? Okay. Okay. Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our session. Our session is hosted by the Indigenous Environmental Network. We are international. We have a long history working on Indigenous people's rights with environmental justice, economic justice, climate justice issues. So today we have a topic of linking colonialism with climate and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what most of you know as IPCC, released its first report in 1990. And after over 30 years that this body has been meeting, finally last year, 2022, the word colonialism finally made its way into the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. The report finally naming colonialism as a historical and ongoing driver of the climate crisis. This session is to have a brief dialogue with representatives of Indigenous peoples and a representative of local communities in South Africa. The focus of discussion is the link between colonialism, climate, and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Article 6 is currently being negotiated at this COP28 that will have far-reaching negative effects that will create the largest carbon market, carbon trading, carbon offset regime that would include using carbon dioxide removals, both biological and engineered removals, such as forests, soils, agriculture, and water offsets are nature-based solutions. And also geoengineering technologies such as carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, and solar modification and manipulation, and even marine geoengineering. More and more studies are finding that these technologies and market systems used by the fossil fuel industry to justify more extraction do not cut emissions at source. So with colonialism comes land grabbing, capitalism, or what we call climate capitalism, industrial development of extraction, and even criminalization and assassination of our Mother Earth and Father Sky defenders. Each speaker will be given 2 questions. You will have 5 minutes each. Our Portuguese speaker will be given more minutes. Paganga, you're our first on my left. You come from Alaska. Many people I have met from Alaska, especially from the northern region, have told me they come from the top of the world, from the Arctic region. Can you briefly share to the audience some colonial history related to the takings of the land of the Alaska Natives and oil colonialism?
Thank you. Wanga atka bangangang nang nakabangawi, wanga ataka akanaterma naka Kirsten Nugok Pass, wanga sivunga kami. So I come from St. Lawrence Island, and it's an island that's in the Bering Strait region. So if you don't know, there's only 2 thoroughways to the Arctic Ocean, the Bering Strait and the Fram Strait. And so I'm going to give you a brief colonial history of our community and Alaska as a whole. And we know that the purpose behind colonization is always resource extraction. And the first step is always genocide. And after that is the indoctrination and the assimilation attempts. And I learned that from Ricky Tagaban in our communities. So there's been several waves of colonization and genocide in our region. The first of which was the European whalers who came and they decimated the whale population in the late 1800s. And the same time this happened, there was an eruption of Krakatoa, and it caused a plume that was so great that it caused 2 winters, 2 years of straight winter in Alaska. And so this meant starvation because we didn't have our marine mammals to sustain us, and we had to survive 2 years of winter. So 99% of our population was wiped out on our island. So after this, there was the sale or purchase of Alaska between 2 governments. And the sale and purchase agreement looks different depending on which language and which country you're reading it in. One of them says it's the sale of a few forts, and the other one says it's the sale of the entirety of our land. And this also complicated things because we had to repopulate our island with our relatives over from Siberia. And so we have very strong ties to the people in the land over there. And when I was born, I was gifted with china and an embroidered blanket with my name on it. We have very close relations over there, which then was strained during the Cold War. And we had a very difficult time staying connected to one another. And during this time, there was a military base built on our island large enough to sustain 200 troops for 2 years. And this, at the time that it was, they wanted people to leave. They didn't want the base usable by anybody. So they were told to take their backpacks, cut the lines, and leave. So they spilt fuel, heavy metal solvents, and other toxics on our island, which seeped into the lagoon and poisoned people. And it's not a question of if we get cancer, it's when, for those of us who are at the place called Northeast Cape at this time. So if you look at Alaska, it's actually divided into 13 regions. And if you look at the map of the regions, it's divided by resource. It's not necessarily divided by culture. And so it's very clear why our land was colonized and why it is that our land was stripped from us, the rights to our land. We were only granted 10% access to our land and 3% to the subsistence that we once had. So, so all in all, colonialism has severed us from our land, and I'm reminded of a quote from an elder in our region who she had learned her language from a very young age, but had never been on her land because they were forcibly removed from their island, and she set foot on her land for the first time when she was 60 years old. And she said there are words that she had learned that didn't make any sense until she actually stepped foot on her land. And so the taking of our land not only takes where we occupy, but it's where we spiritually occupy. It's where our culture thrives. And so colonialism is very insidious. It really rips away at who we are as human beings, and it's all for the purpose of resource extraction.
Thank you. I have a second question. You work educating and organizing people about geoengineering technologies. I understand there were recent meetings in the Arctic Circle being bombarded by promoters of geoengineering techno fixes. What is happening? As you know, carbon removals are being discussed and planned under Article 6 here at the COP. And those Article 6 discussions have impacts that can devastate indigenous communities, and they dominate right now climate policies. Have the people been told about these dangers? How are these creating new threats in the Arctic?
Thank you. So part of our history also was the experimentation. This was part of the dehumanization process. And so the military actually injected people with radioactive iodine to see if we would survive longer in the cold. And so we have a really strong history of having been used as both the stepping stool and the dumping ground of Western science, of governments, of academic institutions. And so I carry that history and that resilience with me while I learned and also inform people about geoengineering, because geoengineering testing is happening on our lands. It was happening at the community at the very, very top of the Arctic. There was a company who was spreading football fields worth of silica hollow glass microspheres without talking to our Indigenous folks, without getting the free, prior, and informed consent. And the testing that they're using, the testing models and questions that they're using are single dimensional, too simplistic. They don't take into consideration the ecosystem that we have a deep, long relationship with, that we understand. So that the questions they were asking was, is silica toxic to ingest? They were asking, will it thicken the ice? But they weren't asking, how will this impact the amount of sunlight that reaches into the life forms that belong in the ice, like the algae that forms in the ice. They weren't asking about the bacteria. They weren't asking about the phytoplankton that will become malnourished because they're going to overconsume silica and not actually be able to eat what they normally eat. They also weren't looking at the breakage of the hollow glass microspheres. We got a sample of what they had used at that site, and 10% of it was broken. And if you have crystalline or jagged silica and you inhale that, that causes tuberculosis. That's actually why we have a high rate of tuberculosis where I'm from, because there's a great amount of silica in the gravel that we ride on, that we drive on. And there's also a high rate of rheumatoid arthritis because of the amount of silica that we already have. So increasing the amount of silica is going to be detrimental to our already fragile health because of what has been done historically. And we're not being informed of this. And the conversations about whether or not these experiments will be sanctioned are not happening at the community level. They're happening in places like the Arctic Assembly and other high-level places like the UN, where it's just simply inaccessible for us to reach that conversation. There are other experiments that are happening with stratospheric aerosol injection, where they want to spray millions of tons of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. And their own computer simulations show that this is going to cause drought in the Amazon rainforest, and that it's going to disrupt monsoon cycles in Southeast Asia. They are also talking about doing marine cloud brightening, where they're going to spray nanoparticles made from the sea. And we already know that marine trafficking is having a very detrimental impact on our lifestyle, our lifeways, our relative animals. And we also know that this will, too, disrupt monsoon cycles. And they're also trying to dump iron ore, millions of tons of iron ore into our ocean. And the last time they did an experiment like this, the rate of toxic algal blooms increased. And so these experiments that are happening without our knowledge, without our consent, are having direct impacts on us already. And those are the types of technologies, so-called technologies, that would be sanctioned under Article 6.
Thank you. Wow. One of the resistance that we as Indigenous peoples at these UNFCCC are experiencing anytime we do interventions, asking the parties, the governments, to support language that recognizes free, prior, and informed consent. We get no support at all. So our next speaker has come here from the other part of Mother Earth. Magoma, welcome to this panel. Good to see you again. Last time we saw each other was at the COP27 in Egypt. Along with Liz McDade, you were awarded the 2018 Goldman Environmental Prize for the African region for your work and others' work around using the courts to stop a Russian South African nuclear deal in 2017. Again, I shake your hands. Nuclear and radioactive colonialism has been a long history in my homelands in the Southwest region of the United States. Can you share with us a brief history of colonialism in South Africa?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for inviting me to come and share with you. Firstly, I would like to maybe say that we just didn't use the courts. The courts were our last resort to fight against the construction of nuclear reactors or new nuclear reactors in South Africa. More or less 600 years of colonialism in Africa. And this has brought misery to our forebearers, and who fought so much that some of us are taking the baton now, but we're taking it on a different fight. When our lands were colonized, there was mining that actually made people to be taken to other places and not in their forebearers' land. And that was the first kind of a violation of people's rights, of eroding their dignity. If you take someone's land, you're eroding their dignity. And this has continued in different forms. Colonialism has continued in different forms. And that continuing in different forms, it has brought about a division of the people, because there are people who still feel that it is important for mining to continuously take place, and without taking into consideration the devastating impacts around that. Our waters have been poisoned, our air has been poisoned, and moreover, our people's cultures, traditions, and spirituality is being lost. And this kind of colonialism that we have today, of extractives, is a kind of colonialism that actually still depicts the more than 500 years of colonialism that happened, although it happens in a different form. And today we find that this colonialism is going to the extreme. And going to the extreme, it takes away people's livelihoods. It takes people's, it erodes people's dignity. People no longer know themselves. They think they're something else totally different. But then Africa being the hottest continent, the heat, it's rising. And this is causing the destruction not only of nature, but in a few years or decades, then we'll see the extinction of the human race itself. Thank you.
Thank you. In all my travels, talking with indigenous peoples throughout the world, we're fighting for our collective rights, our inherent rights. Also, I've met a lot of local communities fighting for their human rights. All have intervened with the word fighting for dignity. Fighting for dignity. So it's good to hear that again. My second question is, in South Africa, I have witnessed colonialism, not as much as you have. I was just a visitor and an ally to some of the groups that are fighting around climate and energy justice. So I've witnessed also industrialized and corporate centralized energy systems of coal and other dirty energy generation. Climate change is very extreme in Africa, with some scientists saying there needs to be a 1.0 Celsius target, not a 0.5, not a 1.5. The ecosystems are different there. Can you speak a bit about how you see the carbon markets and offset mechanisms and carbon removal technologies being discussed and planned for Article 6 that create existing impacts of colonial and climate policies and creating new threats to health, lands, water, and air in South Africa?
South Africa is one of those countries that have committed themselves towards a low carbon economic development. And the targets have been set for 2030 and the targets have been set for 2050. And we just developed what we call a just transition framework. And that framework outlines what needs to be done so that we can have a low carbon economic development, taking into consideration the material conditions that we live under. False solutions are false solutions. You cannot have carbon capture storage. Say that you have the right to pollute and capture the carbon. That's not how things are done. We need nature-based solutions, not really to find ourselves trying to do something that has not been done. I may be naive, but I don't know where carbon capture storage has successfully been implemented. The other thing is, why do you want to offset the consumerism that we're involved in? Needs to tell us that we are depleting what we have. So offsetting, it's not going to be any solution to climate change. The offsetting that we need is just to leave everything as it is. Just don't uproot any trees, just don't flatten hills, don't flatten any mountains. Make sure that you don't bring your geoengineering, and also ensure that the protection of the biodiversity in each and every area, it's also because as people we protect that, because that links to our cultures, that links to our traditions, that links to our spirituality. So we will protect that, but we need also our governments to wake up, and waking up for them to be able to, together with the people, have the kind of legislation and regulations, policies that would not allow a continuity of colonialism by getting companies, multinational corporations from other continents to come and further plunder our continent. So, false solution, this is not what we'd support, and we expect at these negotiations that whatever is being agreed upon, the protection of biodiversity should be the priority, so that the climate can be protected. But also not just protecting the biodiversity, but protecting the climate protectors, because we also are under threat for exposing false solutions.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next speaker, Vadanera, we call her Val for short. You have traveled here to Dubai from a long way, from Acre, Brazil, the Amazon. Welcome to this panel. I know your chief, Ninawa, who was not able to attend the COP28. Can you briefly share some knowledge of your peoples of the Amazon on how the history of colonization has affected your people?
Obrigado, Tom, pela oportunidade. Em nome do Ninauá, eu sou grata a estar aqui na COP28. Ele não está presente aqui pessoalmente, mas espiritualmente ele esteja conosco. Eu quero compartilhar aqui um pouco do colonialismo do povo da Amazônia, principalmente do meu povo, né, o povo Runicuim. No passado, o povo Runicuim e o povo da Amazônia era bem livre, né? Viviam na floresta, na água, nos seus territórios. Eles não tinham limite para viver naquele lugar. Então, eles não tinham fronteiras. Eles viviam onde eles achavam que era bom e era melhor de eles estar convivendo. E, na época, veio chegando os seringalista, vieram chegando e impactando a população indígena. E hoje, a gente vive nos territórios, né, que nem todos os territórios são demarcados. Hoje, a população indígena, eles vivem colado num pedaço de terra. E isso ainda não é respeitado, que os territórios não são demarcados, todos os territórios. E para isso, a gente pede urgência que todos os territórios da população indígena da Amazônia que seja demarcado. Com esse colonialismo, vem causando muita destruição. Esse ano de 2023, no início do ano, foi uma alagação quase na Amazônia toda, onde matou todos os produtos, matou os animais, e foi um desastre que a população sofreu muito. E esses últimos meses é o mês de secura na Amazônia. O rio secou, os peixes não tem, estão indo embora. Com tanta secura, não tem as frutas mais que vem dando na época. Então, os animais também estão sumindo. Com isso, a população indígena está sofrendo bastante com essa mudança climática na Amazônia, com esta secura. As mulheres indígenas sofrem muito com a perda dessa água. A gente precisa que esteja uma solução que pare com esses desmatamentos. Por que essa mudança climática está acontecendo? É por causa das poluições. Obrigada.
Thank you, thank you. The Hunakwai delegation has come to these UN FCCC COP meetings many times, demanding real action that addresses the climate crisis we are all experiencing. Your chief Ninawa has supported the need to keep fossil fuels in the ground and has called numerous times for immediate phase out. He spoke many times that the Hunakwai peoples are experiencing the reality of devastation, like you mentioned, with your water and the flooding, and also about the health. Can you tell us what is happening like this that is a result of no action? You see here at this COP a lot of talk from wealthy governments that do not want to phase out fossil fuels. And they're having different negotiations under Article 6 that support reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, RED, and other forest and conservation offsets. So how does this affect your people? Do you support those solutions like geoengineering and carbon markets?
Eu, particularmente, não apoiamos o mercado de carbono, porque isso é o impacto para a população indígena. A gente não vê uma solução real, porque os indígenas que estão aqui participando, eles não estão participando das negociações. Eu acho que precisa mais ter consulta na população indígena dos territórios, não só os seus representantes. Nós precisamos que acabe com essa negociação, respeite o direito da população indígena. Nós queremos que pare com essas poluições, com essa negociação, porque nós não se vendemos. O território é nosso corpo, a água é a nossa vida. Então, nós precisamos que sejamos respeitados. Nós queremos viver Nós queremos estar livre dessas poluições, porque nós não tem mais nada natural nos territórios indígenas. Estão contaminados os peixes, estão contaminados. No Acre foi feita uma pesquisa que 75% dos peixes estão contaminados de mercúrio. Então, isso causa doença. Vem adoecendo muitas as mulheres e as crianças, principalmente os indígenas que vivem nos territórios. E esse impacto para nós é uma destruição. E nós não aceitamos isso.
Thank you. Thank you. Javon, you are next. Welcome to the so-called mainlands. But you are from the mainlands of the Micronesian islands of the Pacific Ocean. Can you briefly share some colonial history of being so-called colonized by 3 countries, Spain, Germany, and Japan, and later under trusteeship of the United States? But Micronesia has achieved independence. How has colonialism affected your people, including militarization and rising tides from climate change?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to start by thanking my auntie from the Amazon, Val. The other day, you came to the Indigenous Youth Forum and spoke to Indigenous youth, and I just wanted to thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. But I just wanted to say, Hafade, Guahu si Javan Santos, Guahu Tau Tau Tomhom, Gaigi Tau Tau Tanu Gita Guahan. My name is Javan Santos. I am an Indigenous Chamorro to the island of Guahan. My people are from the village of Tomhom, now known as Tumon, the tourist district for the island, and my people were displaced, or my family was displaced after World War II when my family was moved after the conflict in our island. In Guahan, also known as Guam, Guam is the oldest colony, continuing colony in the Pacific. We were first colonized in 1521 when Ferdinand Magellan landed in our islands. We were a colony of Spain from that point on to 1898, and that colonization continued to impact our island's culture. It was considered illegal to speak our indigenous language, Chamorro, under Spanish colonial rule and practice traditional knowledge in public. So a lot of traditional culture has either aligned with the Catholic Church or has disappeared. So in the context of climate change, my indigenous people have suffered from many increasing storms for our island. In May this year, our island was impacted by a super typhoon, and that has continued to impact our island to this day. There is rolling blackouts, there is debris from the typhoon that, because we're in a small island, there is no place to put it, so it sits there for months, continuing to this day. And another thing that I wanted to share is that Guam is considered a part of the U.S. territory to this day, and our island and our people had received citizenship from the U.S. in order to continue, or in order for eminent domain to be used in our island. And many of the island's military, many of the island many of the land of the island no longer belongs to the indigenous people, but 30% of the island today is indigenous, or 30% of the island today is military base. And so my island has always been on the intersection of conflict and war and colonialism being seen as the tip of the spear in the Asia Pacific region. And the military has also had a huge impact on the island's environment. One of the major issues is that there is active military trainings in our island where the military are shooting test launching weapons and missiles that are affecting the soil of our pristine limestone forests. They are testing this ammunition over our waters, where many of the our ocean life is impacted by the sounds or the debris from the ammunition. And so in the islands, the indigenous people have intentionally not had informed consent on what happens in our island. We've had consultations and the community has had consultations, but the U.S. continues to assert security as a way to keep our people in conflict, continue to hurt the environment and the community of our islands, and continue to perpetuate 500 years of colonialism for the indigenous people.
Yeah, thank you. You're with the Micronesian Climate Change Alliance that has been active in these COP meetings, in fact, since Paris in 2015. You spoke about the rising tides of the ocean. I have heard the Alliance demanding real climate solutions, not false solutions. Can you explain the concerns your Alliance has with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that's being negotiated right now?
Yes. So in our islands, we see Article 6 as a way to perpetuate the use of fossil fuels. And yes, the rising tides in our island mean that the impacts to our community is that our islands are overtaken by the ocean that provides us with food, and that issue creates a disconnect from the indigenous community to what is supposed to be a nurturing ocean for our people. And so in our island, not only is the rising tides the issue, it's also increasingly worse storms. And so another thing about our island is that a lot of the power continues to come from fossil fuels. And in the island, we see there's push for transitioning from currently burning diesel to currently burning liquefied natural gas. And the fossil fuel lobby in our island is very hesitant to continue or to move away towards renewable energy. And so we are concerned that we're concerned that will continue, that the lobby will continue to emit fossil fuels and continue to uphold continue to emit and use carbon capture, carbon sequestration as a way to continue perpetuating the extraction, continue to perpetuating the burning. And so we are, I speak for myself and I speak for indigenous communities across the Pacific that we need a fossil fuel phase out, and any of the projects that are being used as an offset to that need to consider indigenous Pacific Islanders, because if these communities are impacted by rising tides, then and this carbon sequestration is not achieving the goals of mitigating climate change, mitigating sea level rise, then our traditional way of life is at risk. Our traditional cultural locations are at risk. And so my hope is that our communities are heard and that Article 6 is not used as a distraction away from a fossil fuel phase out.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. We heard a lot of key demands. Just transition was mentioned. The move and importance of a phase out, moving away from fossil fuel dependency, and also to avoid these distractions. We made a comment earlier this week about what our demands are with our Indigenous delegation. And we said the climate crisis demands a rapid transition. You heard that terminology a lot. A rapid transition for a binding. We want to see a legally binding phase-out agreement, not a voluntary. That doesn't work. But a binding global phase-out of fossil fuels and all extraction and production at source. At source is very important. Our Indigenous network has studied these mitigation strategies and policies for years. I attended the first COP meeting, was COP4 in 1998 in Argentina. I was sent there under the authority of spiritual elders, but also federally recognized tribal nations in the United States. There were youth and women's societies to go and take part in these negotiations to address climate change. So I think I have a good understanding of what my relatives here are saying. There's a need to address this issue. It's a life and death issue, that's what I heard. A life and death from the top of the world, from the Arctic Circle to Africa, to the island, Pacific Islands. I've talked to many people all over the world, South America, Southeast Asia, the Sami in Northern Europe. So we are a big coalition. So we cannot talk about the fossil fuel phase out without talking about climate finance and funding and the inequities with that. We cannot talk about this without lifting up our relationship, which is a spiritual relationship, not just a cultural relationship that we have with the female creative energy of Mother Earth and Father Sky. So we are not just water protectors, but sky protectors as well. That's why it's good to have this session. And we're going to have some time for some questions you may have, if you can direct it to our speakers. But there's a lot of risk and uncertainties that you have heard around carbon capture and storage and carbon dioxide removal technologies that include solar radiation manipulation and modification, and the privatization and commodification of carbon, of greenhouse gases. It was surprising to us years ago when we studied that, to bring the air that we breathe, the carbon, into a capitalist market system. They got to determine whose property right that is. So it becomes a property right issue to treat carbon as a commodity. Our elders back home did not understand that. Chief Ninawa did not understand that. How can they own the carbon as well as they're owning or renting, they say, the carbon in the trees, carbon credits, pieces of paper? It's an ownership. The contradiction and irony is that it's the polluting industry, Chevron. I don't know if Chevron's here. Shell, Conoco, but they are the ones buying the carbon credits. That's their money. It's not World Bank money. It's not public money from the country. It's polluters' money. And what it allows them to say is that they're going carbon neutral. They're using net zero in that terminology. These corporations are not cutting back. We were part of the release of a report with other NGO allies, Rainforest Action Network, Oil Change International, a group called Bank Track. It's called Banking on Climate Chaos. Our last report this past April found that since 2015 of the Paris Agreement, there's supposed to have been a commitment, well, not a legal commitment, a voluntary commitment of the governments reducing their emissions, but it wasn't legally binding. What we found through the study and research that the banks have increased money investment in fossil fuel, $5.5 trillion. $5.5 trillion in the expansion of fossil fuels since 2015. So that's what we're trying to convey to people of the world, to humanity. One of our human rights, indigenous rights attorney that's well respected with the Spanish-speaking indigenous peoples of Latin America participated in the United Nations Working Group on drafting the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for close to 20 years. He was with us in Paris, with us on the signing of the governments of that Paris Agreement. He said, this is nothing but a trading instrument. It's a trading agreement, nothing else. It was full of trading of carbon mechanisms, biodiversity offsets, conservation. Now they reframed it from red to nature-based solutions. So we got to look at the detail. Look at what's printed there as far as resources, because there's a lot of reports that are coming out now. And this is going to be a crime against humanity and Mother Earth. Thank you. And at that point, we're going to have 2 questions. So if you have a question, please be clear. Like to have a question rather than a statement, and direct it to one of our speakers. Thank you. Kamel, can you help me in case someone has a question with the...
Hi, is this on? Yes? Okay. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. I really appreciated hearing your stories. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you imagine Indigenous leadership in a venue like UNFCCC looking like. You know, if the voices aren't being heard at the table, what is the future of the Indigenous voice in the UNFCCC? What have you thought about moving towards demanding a different form of representation? What does that look like?
Thank you for that. I think one thing is imagining the future of leadership in our territories, because that's where things are happening. That is where things should happen. Yes, we are at this space, and this space has been there, I think, for almost 2 decades. But why have the indigenous people, people in different areas not being included at the negotiating table? I think that's an important question. Our fight, our struggles, it's not to find ourselves in those tables, but more for our territories to be protected. So I'm imagining a future of leaders in our own areas protecting their environment with their lives. We are in a war of survival, and to make a difference, let's do it at our local territories. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. And please tell us who you are, and no statement, but a question to one of our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Francisco, I'm Francisco from Mexico. My question is, I understand that there is a negotiations group. Who is, do you know who is representing indigenous peoples at that negotiations table?
Yes, it's a good question for those of you that don't know of the important role of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. Our organization was one of the founders of that, with many others that represent different indigenous peoples from different regions of the world, 7 regions of the world. So I'm really proud of what we call the Indigenous Caucus. They meet every day at 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. in a building nearby here. But I'm impressed because they're all taking responsibility on staying on top of these negotiations. Some are taking part in the Article 6 deliberations. Some are taking part in loss and damage. So when these topics first came up in the first meetings of the Indigenous Caucus, there was a lot of discussions about what these terminologies are. Some indigenous peoples were more involved and informed about the history of the negotiation. But I was very inspired with the young generation that were here, that they're taking part now, and so it's very educational. But a lot of people volunteered to take part in these different negotiations taking place. But we're limited to only take part as observers. We are not negotiators. That's the parties or the governments that are represented. They have different colored badges. But we find even our indigenous peoples that were lucky to get accredited by their government do not take part in the negotiation sessions preparatory, but we're having a start. A lot of good interaction. There's communication through signal to each other. We keep on top of things. But I would take part in the caucus tomorrow, catch up, and I think I got the time fingers about time limitation. Is that colonialization or no? I don't know. We have timekeepers back home in our native indigenous meetings too. But I appreciate your patience. I appreciate your attention to what we're saying, your questions, and thank you, my relatives that were volunteered to sit here and share your stories, linking colonialism to climate and to Article 6. Thank you, and you all have a good evening.